Welcome to Guardians of the Data. I'm your host, Ward Balcerzak. Each episode will explore the passions, expertise, and real-world experiences of security leaders who are helping the future of data security and governance. Guardians of the Data is made possible by support from Sentra. To learn more about our AI-powered data security platform, please visit sentra.io. Let's dive in. Thank you for joining another episode of Guardians of the Data. Today, got a great guest, former colleague and a mentor of mine. 25 years in IT, about 15 in cybersecurity, focused mostly on data protection, insider risk, and cyber strategic planning. He's built data protection organizations and programs at multiple large enterprises. Please welcome Trevor Dolan. Hey, man.
Hey, Ward. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
All right. In every episode of Guardians of the Data, we dive into the biggest data security issues affecting organizations. So, Trevor, in your professional opinion, what's the biggest data security challenge organizations are facing?
So many to choose from, Ward. But when I really take a chance to think about it, it really gets back to the fundamentals and the challenges that I've seen with a lot of organizations out there, both from a consulting side, but also being on the industry side, is balancing regulatory requirement compliance with the actual fundamentals behind data protection and the spirit behind protecting data for users and the company. So getting down to it, moving into holistic data protection program governance, as opposed to quote unquote check the box or ad hoc deployment of technology or point solution. So, at a high level, I think that's one of the biggest challenges is, for organizations really to design with balancing that risk management, technology usage, but also aligning for business value to meet the needs for their organization.
Totally agree. And you've obviously done this a time or two, Trevor. So if that's the biggest challenge, how have you tried to solve for that challenge? What have you done in those organizations?
Sure. So over the course of my experience in standing up data protection organizations and learning from successes and failures, I've kind of developed an approach that balances both programmatic governance with technology deployment and operations, as well as providing that feedback loop as well, so that you can govern and continuously improve the organization. So we broke it down into essentially five main areas. First main area being more focused around governance and leadership. And at a high level, that's making sure that you have a good foundation from a leadership perspective of developing and defining the scope, getting buy-in from key stakeholders, and really aligning the program to get started. Second major area is assessing where you are. Where are you today? Leveraging frameworks like NIST CSF or others that are out there. Do a maturity assessment, identify where you are currently, where you want to be, and developing a roadmap. Third one is making sure that you have good policies and procedure frameworks to support what you are doing and clearly define those requirements for the organization, but also for the technology to enforce. Finally, fourth is training and awareness to make sure that those policies, those frameworks, and those requirements are disseminated throughout the organization, and the employee and the workforce understand what those expectations are. And then finally, from a team and organizational structure, make sure you have the right mix of team members from an engineering, operational, and a governance perspective to support the mission and to deliver the capabilities for the organization.
Love it. Love it. And again, it's clear you've done this a time or two. So let's start at number one. Let's dive into, I think you said it was governance and leadership. So one thing I really keyed off of, and in a few of the episodes we've touched on this, key stakeholders. And I know I've struggled this a few times at organizations I've worked for. Who are the right people? How do I get them to listen to me? How do I get them to the table? What have you done in there? How have you been successful with that?
Yeah, so let's talk about the who those key stakeholders are first, and we'll talk about the approach. So some of them are very obvious from a key stakeholder perspective. Obviously, you want to make sure that your cybersecurity program is aligned throughout the cybersecurity ranks, and that includes from a risk management perspective to chief security officer. But then expanding beyond that is privacy. So for your organization, if you have a privacy organization, making sure that that is in alignment with privacy, local laws and regulations, as well as legal department. And on top of that, you would need to have HR, and some organizations have employee relations, making sure that that's in alignment as well. And then finally, your key business leaders. So for each of your lines of businesses and or your subsidiaries, making sure that those business leaders are at the very least identified as key stakeholders and as part of the information feedback lifecycle, but also ideally to be part of the kickoff of the program so that their feedback and requirements are included as well as to make sure that you have a holistic approach for the organization.
Nice, nice. So it's a big list, right? A lot of people, or could be a lot of people. Maybe a few people are wearing multiple hats, which is helpful. But how do you then identify and actually get them to not think you're big brother and you're there to actually partner and help?
Yeah, yeah. So it really starts to build on a foundation of trust with the organizational leaders, and making sure that you meet with them to talk through what are their requirements and framing it up in a sense that's relatable to them. So when you're talking to business leaders, talk about, what are their business operations? What are their critical services that they provide internally and externally for the organization to make money and maintain business? And then relating that back to cybersecurity laws, regulations, and requirements as it pertains to supporting business functions, either from a facilitation of automation or risk management or reducing overall risk or cost or cybersecurity governance, and then mapping that back to your frameworks for your requirements to make sure that you speak with understanding what they require for a day-to-day functionality perspective, but matching that up against what is needed for good security. And in doing so, you're able to make the connection between the business and the security requirements and start having that conversation that guides them down the path of more specifically data protection. We get down to the data protection components of protecting the customer's information and or employee or our company's data information. It is very much tied back to the business and potential impacts to the capabilities of the overall welfare of the organization and the ability to provide those services to the customer. So that's the key. There is to find that foundation between you, build that rapport that we both have a common goal and approach to protecting the organization, but also make sure that we provide those good services. And then that helps to establish that trust. Doing that across the board with your different business leaders helps to inform you on what's important to both or to each of those business leaders and their organization, but also for them to start understanding the approach from a cybersecurity perspective that this is not we're going to be watching and reading all your emails just for the fun of it, approach. This is more of a we're collectively going to be working together to make sure that we manage risk within the environment that's appropriate based off of the business needs, but also doing it in a way that is relatively open and soliciting feedback from the business so you have the right size solutions developed. So that's really the key behind establishing that rapport and adjusting based off of those business personalities in the leadership side to make sure you build out the right foundations.
I like how you phrased that business personalities. I know I've worked with a few folks in the past that you sit down and talk to them, and you can tell from the beginning they don't want to talk to you, right? They don't want to talk to security. They probably got burned in the past by a different security team or leader, and they don't want that to happen again, right? They want to move quickly, and do whatever, right? Stand up a new solution, new AI, what have you. Um, how have you dealt with the individual that clearly wants to hold you back with that barrier, right? That 10-foot pole, and instead of actually partnering and realizing you're there to help.
Yeah, I mean it's a challenge and it's different every time, but key items that I would focus on is establishing that common ground, establishing a personal connection with the individuals that are in question here, and going back to my comment before is focusing back on what is that common goal? Like, hey, we're here to support the business. We're here to manage risk and do the right thing. So using that as the foundation, and then backing it up with some data. I want to avoid the fear and uncertainty of leveraging DLP data in a conversation right off the bat, but at the same time leveraging, some initial data just to show that what we're talking about here is a real risk. And when you put that on the table for discussion, that helps to reframe the approach and hopefully to recenter those conversations around that common goal and the ability for you to work together to really develop those solutions and move forward.
Very nice. And I think what you just said relates to your second item that you mentioned in there, which was risk assessment baseline, right? So tell me about that. Like, what are you doing within a risk assessment baseline, and why is that helpful in conquering data security challenges?
Yeah. So, I mean, after establishing your risk appetite with the organizational functions, HR, legal, risk, and business, you want to be able to understand, if our risk appetite right now is at a moderate or a low, how are we actually doing against that risk appetite? Are we meeting our own goals in protecting or protecting the organization and managing risk? To do that, really you need to take a more methodical approach as opposed to just kind of guessing, and leveraging a risk maturity assessment is really one of the better ways of doing that, where it is focusing on something like NIST CSF as a baseline framework or CIS controls, that broken down through all the different controls, specific to subcomponents, both technology as well as program and governance, and doing an assessment of current state against those controls. What do you have? What do you not have? Also leveraging something like a CMMI maturity scale, so a 1 through 5 scale. And just be honest as you go through it. If you kind of have it, but you don't have it, then just mark it as a 0, because you don't want to count yourself as having these things and not really being able to meet the spirit behind having them. So taking a methodical approach, usually that's done working with your risk management partners and/or potentially within your audit groups, to go down through the list of the core corporate organization as well as your sublines of businesses if you want to get down to that level of detail, and working through the different controls. Once you are done with that, that'll give you a good mapping of good, bad, and the ugly of the areas that you need to address. And then you align that back to the risk appetite. If your risk appetite is low, then you would want to look at having higher targets of maturity within those different areas that you have deficiencies. That helps you to get a prioritized list of hotspots of things that you need to invest in. And then when we get back to specific to data protection, insider threat, and incident management, from those perspectives, that helps you to also identify where your technology investments should be, as well as your people, and then also your programmatic investments as well. So that lays the foundation for the planning, the financials, but then also the current state and the future state, not only so that you can speak back to the line of business partners on what you're doing and how you're doing, as far as addressing those risks and managing those spaces, but it also helps from a regulatory and or audit perspective in measuring your maturity as well as your performance within those spaces.
All really good stuff. And as you're talking through that, there was really two things that I got a little PTSD on, just remembering back to some of my own organizations and how I had to deal with it. And I'm curious on how you dealt with it. So the first one was aligning data security items to a framework. And the difficulty I've always had is sometimes it's nebulous, right? Thou shall do X. Well, okay. Sometimes, those frameworks or whatnot don't say you must have a DLP solution to that, or you must have data that's tokenized to meet it. So, how have you sat down, looked at it and put let's call it like maybe a common sense approach to actually answering, how you're meeting those?
Yeah, I think that's a good item to call out and worth probably a much longer discussion. But at a high level, the approach that I've taken is similar to what I laid out with the outline of our discussion here. Is when you look at a data protection organization and NIST CSF framework requirements, you're right. It doesn't specifically call out directly like you need to have these technologies or you need to have this kind of an operational cycle or ITIL continuous service improvement function. But when you extrapolate and kind of extrapolate those requirements and combine those together with some other foundational capabilities like ITIL and the rest, really it becomes very familiar as far as things that you've seen before. As establish your foundations from a governance perspective, charter, scope, authority. Establishing your risk management. Where are you today versus where are you tomorrow? Policies and procedures, training and awareness, and then getting down to the technology stacks. Technology stacks would then be enforcing those things that you had the foundational requirements around. And you can leverage the NIST CSF or other assessments frameworks really to get down more into the nitty gritty. But moving beyond what typically is prescribed and or easily discoverable out there on the web as far as like maturity assessment capabilities. But the focus would be following that same pattern of, if you have a technology, why do you have that technology? Does it tie back to a policy and procedure or a legal or a regulatory requirement? And if it does, great. Is it actually set up to enforce? Is it set up to support compliance and requirements? What are those capabilities behind it? And how does that tie back to the business? And making sure that those items are being assessed in a point by point, section by section approach. That helps to not only provide a structure, but also provide a way to measure specifically to the domain that you're within. So in this case, we're talking about data protection, DLP, insider threat, all the subcomponents of that as well. There's a lot of areas that we can double click on there, but the approach is very similar of, following that well-tread path of assessing program maturity along with the technology capabilities.
Very nice. And you actually went to the next thing I wanted to dig into without even knowing it. So kudos to you on that one. But and again, I've been burned a few times on this. I know you have as well, because you and I were arm in arm going at this together. But what happens when you sit down with your stakeholders and you show them your maturity assessment and they don't agree, right? You say, "Oh, we're a 1." They say, "Oh no, we're a 3," or whatever it ends up being. Like, how do you handle those conversations to really, drive consensus maybe, and hopefully next steps, roadmap, etc.
Yeah. So it really gets back to like we talked about earlier of building that rapport with your stakeholders, and establishing that trust. And if that trust is still being developed, a lot of it can be augmented by the data. So leveraging the data, something that's indisputable, to bring to the table for that discussion so that you can show, de facto, here's proof of, from a DLP perspective or a DSPM scan, that there's scary stuff that's out there. And because there's scary stuff out there, and if this is a sample, a 10% sample of the environment, then we can extrapolate that there is a pervasive problem, or maybe it's not a pervasive problem, but maybe it's a moderate problem. And, having that conversation around, here's the data. Do we agree that this data, is a problem, and moving away from the, potential personalities and egos within this, the various spaces, and focusing more on solving the problem, that helps you get that common ground of, hey, we're here together to work together to solve the problem and protect the organization. And, sets the table, so to speak, for you to really focus more on, solving the issue at hand, as opposed to, working with, political, realignment and issues there.
Awesome. Awesome. And it feels like everything you just walked through goes naturally right into the third item you said, which was policies and procedures. So, I mean, to me, um, again, doing this a time or two, that's where I've seen a few programs fail, right? Like, if you have good leadership, good alignment, fantastic. You get through the assessment and the baseline, awesome. But then if you don't have policies, procedures, that's where I've seen the stutter step, where I want to do this thing, right? A lot of technical folks skip right to technology. I want to put in this technology, but then they're shocked when they get pushback from a stakeholder, the business, whatever, um, for implementation, because generally they're like, well, why do I have to do that? And it goes back to, you can't be big brother. You can't say, well, because I said so, because I'm the security goon that's telling you. Um, so talk to us about that. What do you typically do to get policies, procedures, and other things in place to set yourself up for success?
Yeah. So early on in the conversation, or the assessment of the organization, you want to make sure that you have a good view of your baseline policies throughout the organization. Do they exist, and what level of rigor has been put behind them from a maturity perspective? So that gets back to the maturity assessment and alignment of your regulatory, legal, and contractual obligations. Ideally, those policies at a high level will map back to those, either directly or referentially, to those requirements. So if you are a GDPR organization, making sure that GDPR fundamentals, but also requirements, are mapped back into your policies, and then also trickling down into your procedures and your standards. Same thing with GLBA and SOX and other requirements that are out there from a regulatory and legal perspective. Having policies that are having a good hierarchy of policy framework, policies, procedures, standards, and then control implementation patterns will not only be pay off in dividends with your IT organization, but also your business organization, from a standpoint of being very clear around the things that you must do versus the things that you should do because they're best practices. And focusing on that must versus should is important, not only for responding to regulatory and or external regulatory audits, as well as internal audits, but also making sure that you have a good foundation for standardized control requirements within your organization for IT implementation as well. So what that means is that you want to be able to map back all the way from the top down to those control implementation patterns, what those requirements are. For instance, if you say that data must be encrypted leveraging AES 256 or whatever else it is, then it needs to be called out somewhere in that hierarchy of those controls of what data is in scope for encryption, how that encryption is to be applied and managed, and then also how is it to be implemented in that technology stack or that specific instance. And as you create that lineage of requirements that become more and more detailed as you go down through that hierarchy, you establish that foundation of not only meeting those regulatory requirements, but also providing to your IT business partners and your other IT development teams clarity around what needs to get done to protect, but also it helps also on the business discussion side because you can map back to having those conversations with your business partners to say, we are, providing clear requirements, and in doing so, it's not just a situation where we in security are saying you should go do these things, go figure it out on your own. You're providing more explicit requirements around those protection mechanisms, so that there's no more interpretation on what can or should, be done. It maps back more to a prescriptive menu approach as opposed to leaving it up to interpretation. The final portion on that, or the final point on that, is that when you provide clear guidance to your IT partners, clear guidance to your business partners, and then you are also able to show through audit and regulatory review that you are meeting those requirements, that establishes internal integrity with your partners, strengthens your relationships with them, as well as meeting the overall goal of truly moving the program forward and strengthening your security posture.
Totally agree. And there are a lot of important things within the policies and procedures, kind of framework, if you will, or bucket. Bucket maybe the better descriptive term. Um, Within an organization, and I'm thinking back to a few that I worked for, and certainly you have in financial services, but thinking back to those organizations that likely have multiple compliance frameworks, multiple third party requirements being put on them. It can kind of feel, I know it did to me, it can kind of feel like you're at the range and you're trying to figure out which target you're actually aiming for, right? Am I going for the far target? Am I going for the one I can hit? How do you sit down and prioritize, or maybe not even prioritize, but determine, here's my 15 different things superimposed. Now here's my actual audit requirements. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I would separate it on two things, especially when you're talking about audit, internal or regulatory. You have to be direct and to the point of what they're requesting. Let's put that aside for another conversation. As far as building out a program and really determining what's the best for the organization, and between budget, risk appetite, and maturity. Um, I, I've historically taken the high watermark as the approach. So if we look at, across the board, our regulatory requirements, what are we required to comply with, or what is best practice compliance? I would always recommend for an organization to, target the higher level of compliance plus plus. And so what I mean by that is it's not just a check the box to say, well, there's a, requirement for us to protect data. Therefore, we have a DLP system in play. But instead, the spirit behind those requirements is what you should be focusing on. Are you truly providing a governance model behind it, a true like self-check and a capability to mature over time, so that when you talk about your compliance towards those requirements, you can say, yes, we check these boxes, but we also have a program and a governance over top of that is continuously improving and continuously adjusting over time to make sure that it's in alignment with not only the requirements, but also our business needs and meeting our business objectives across the organization. So it's an approach of having that foundation in play, keeping that in mind, making sure that you meet that, but getting beyond that so that you build something that really, and I hate to use the cliche, but the sum is greater than the parts. And you have really a stronger platform overall, and a true program as opposed to just point solutions.
And I think it goes back to what you said for your risk assessment side too, where you got to be honest with yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like, again, I'm thinking back a few organizations where you're going through this, and I was working with my stakeholders, and it's like, oh, thou shall do X, and we'll say you had the good example, DLP. You should have a DLP solution. Okay, so Do I say check the box, done? Or do you get into the caveats of, oh, I've got a DLP solution, but it's only monitor only. I'm not doing prevention. I'm only using out of the box rules. I'm not actually looking for intellectual property. I'm only looking for social security numbers. I know you and I were in tons of conversations, hours upon hours of those in our time together. What do just to kind of close that out for our audience, what do you recommend when it comes down to some of those highly caveated control statements or items? Like, what do you recommend to truly think about and mark down for those items?
Yeah. So again, it gets back to the problem statement of, there's no prescriptive solution that's out there from a regulatory requirement perspective to check off the list. Now, the recommendation here, you know, eh, maybe to oversimplify it, is to bring in somebody that's been through those challenges within standing up or managing those systems, and to have a key, trusted advisor to help you with developing those solutions so that it's not a, hey, we just, situation where we just stood up one DLP solution to monitor email only in this small situation, but instead to take a more holistic approach around evaluating, the double clicks. So DLP breaks down into multiple channels. So email, network, web, CASB, endpoint, so on and so forth. Of those, on-prem versus off-prem, client versus third party versus, customer, management as well. And then of each of those, how do you manage it from a technology platform perspective? How do you manage it from a point solution versus a holistic suite solution? Having a trusted partner from that sense to be able to identify what's the, from a standpoint of technology solutions, what's the best fit for the organization that you're working for from a budgetary perspective, but also from a deployment capability, to make sure that those meet those needs, and then mapping that back to those control frameworks, so that you can not only build on those control frameworks to say, all right, DLP solution, check. Okay, well, what's the double click behind that? DLP of on-prem, DLP of off-prem, DLP of user data via email versus application data email. And then going down through those different lists of, like you mentioned, are we just monitoring? Are we monitoring and blocking? Or are we monitoring, blocking, and notifying the users? Being able to have a very complex, path that then cascades beyond that is where you get into those levels of maturity that reaches far beyond the quote, have a DLP solution, and then more into meeting the spirit behind it of truly having a program that can assess and address the risks with the environment within that technology stack.
Love it. Love it. All right. Well, I think a lot of what we just said, again, number one was governance and leadership. Number two, risk assessment baseline. Three, policies and procedures. I think it brings us to number four, which you said, training. and training, we could probably do a whole episode about in and of itself. But I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume that you're speaking a lot more in depth than just what you see a lot of organizations do. It goes, oh, we do phishing training. That's good enough, right? We've got a 30% click rate. Let's get better. Like, what do you think is the right type of training and awareness for data security?
Yeah, I think this is a really good conversation to have because I do feel like, as you mentioned, that a lot of organizations kind of gloss over this. Yes, it's important to have high level information security training, privacy training as well, but it does need to map back to those foundational items that we mentioned. And that's where my recommendation would be to get to the next level down, to have specific training for privacy incident management, data protection specific training. Have an entire module that's focused around that. The do's and the don'ts of, what can I send via email versus what should I not be sending email? And that maps back to those policies and procedures that we talked about earlier. Giving those real world scenarios and tying it back to those policies helps to make it more real to the individuals that are taking it. I've been in organizations that have done a really good job with giving those different use case scenarios and mapping those back to those policies, the acceptable use policy, the employee handbook as well, so that it calls out specific trends that we had been seeing from a data protection perspective of pain points of cases that have been constantly coming up and investigated pertaining to sending things to your personal email account, or sharing client lists with somebody that's outside of the organization, or hey, I'm going to send this work to my Gmail account so I can go work from home or print it from home. Those type of scenarios are things that may be benign at first glance or from the intention of the user, but it's a clear violation of the policies, and it needs to be called out, especially if you're seeing it on a recurrence perspective across the organization, and it's an issue. So making sure that that training and awareness not only ties back to do these things, don't do these things, but also give those examples, and then implement the assessment modules based off of those use cases, so that it is a critical thinking activity as opposed to you know click through the assessment as quickly as possible so you can get to the end and say that you finished your training. Tying that assessment and those trainings together can help with reinforcing what you're trying to implement within the organization, as far as from a data protection perspective. Yes, portions of it is reactionary incident management and investigation, but the other side of it really needs to be a focus around behavior modification and business risk management. And this is where those concepts really collide. And you have a lot of potential between a strong training and awareness program to really meld those technology controls with the business modifications to reduce the risk in a way that is human consumable. And I think probably one of the better ways to say it is done in a more approachable way, as opposed to only reaching out to somebody in the employee ranks when they've done something wrong. You want to address that ahead of time, make sure that those expectations are well communicated, but do it in a way that helps them to really incorporate that in their day to day, so that they feel empowered as far as protecting the organization's data, and they feel part of the mission, as opposed to somebody that's just being watched by Big Brother off reading their emails someplace else.
Yeah, 100%. I think we probably both have, hundreds of examples of, both training and awareness woes, I guess, right? Things that have gone awry. One thing that I always think about when it comes to not the training side, but the awareness side is, and it goes back to your statement about stakeholders and building those relationships, but it goes, you see something, right? A tool lights up, you hear about something, whatever. And the activity in and of itself is not malicious. One that I know I've dealt with time and again, I'm pretty sure you have as well, and you mentioned it, is an employee emailing themselves something, right? And if you think about it just from black and white data security, maybe there's not sensitive data there, right? I think some folks would say, not sensitive data, not proprietary information. I don't care, right? Don't care they emailed themselves, whatever. I've always taken the approach that I think I do still care, right? I want to pull that thread a little bit. I want to dig into, is it just, Jane in development that's doing this, or is it Jane and her entire department? And oh, by the way, what did they send themselves? Was it their own W-2, or was it the application source code for our super secret application, and they were just doing home development. How inevitably, right, in this idea of awareness, an organization's going to come across those things that at face value, it may not seem like a high priority, but as you start to dig in, it may still not be a high priority, but now you gotta figure out, right? You gotta work with the business, say, like, are we actually okay with this? How do you recommend folks tiptoe into those waters of that gray area that is data security?
Yeah, I think that's a good call out, and I think it's a good link back to the beginning of the discussion when we talk about the governance framework and having that feedback loop to the key stakeholders. Training and awareness should be something that not only is just it should not just be a yearly hey, take this training. It should also be matched up against what's your case data that you're seeing as far as investigations from a DLP perspective? What is your, your KRIs and KPIs from a program perspective that you're seeing? And moving from the micro examination of a day-to-day case investigation or a DLP event or a inappropriate storage, from a DSPM perspective being detected, and zooming out to a macro view of what are those trends, those overall use cases that you're seeing, and then having those discussions based off of the data that comes from your source systems, but also the training that has been deployed within the organization, and really having a conversation with the leaders within the governance forums, so legal, HR, your business and technology leaders around what are you seeing from a trend perspective. And when we're talking about trends, it's a rough grouping, but I try to separate one from being inherently damaging to the company, so an insider threat or a DLP violation as being one category at a high level, and then the other one is being broken business processes or risky business processes as another. And when you're having conversations at that executive level, you need to be able to focus on both, but also start producing some solutions around how do you manage risk within those environments. So it's a little bit easier conceptually from a, hey, somebody did something bad and trying to steal something. It's a little bit more of a gray space when you say that this is a risky behavior. Going back to your example of, somebody sending something home, it's not a direct violation of a privacy or a acceptable use policy requirement, but it is interesting as to, well, why are they doing that? And it could lead down to an investigation of either identifying that they, have been collecting all sorts of data and they're looking to leave the organization next week, or they've been doing this forever. And now you have an exposure that, your company data is now being stored on a Yahoo email account, or, other places as well. So being able to track those trends, take some critical thinking along with it, and moving beyond the widget in, widget out incident management approach, and looking more from a problem management perspective, both on the cyber incident management side as well as the business risk management side, gives you that value of really being able to see the forest for the trees, so to speak, and really, also, and this has been my experience in Ward, I know you as well, discovering some deep rooted things that are within the organization that can be really scary, and approaching those with the business without that data, can be a challenge. But if you have that data to support it, and that foundation of here are the trends that we're seeing as opposed to a one point solution or one point incident, it allows you to have a more business risk focused conversation around, what are we going to do with it, as opposed to, more of an authoritative security approach of stop this and make it go away, approach, and, more focused around let's solve this for, the whole organization, as opposed to just, addressing that single solution or a single issue.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And as we've been talking, we've talked about four pillars of your five. And we're about to get to your fifth, but as we've been talking through the four, Sounds like you need an army to do all this, right? Data security, there's a lot of moving pieces. Everything we've talked about, it's touching multiple facets. It's building all these relationships. It's having a lot of these conversations, making sure you have policies, procedures, dealing with audit, yada, 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 right? There's a lot of stuff we talked about. So let's get to number five, team and organizational structure. So I'm going to make the assumption for the audience here, you're not talking about hiring 100 people and saying, go do data security. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, yeah. Great question there, and I think that's the challenge is balancing appropriate delivery of the technologies and programs with a right-sized organizational structure, but starting it in a scalable format. So what I mean by that is it when you start an organization that's focused around data protection, insider threat, and building out that program, you do want to start with some strong leadership that has been there, knows the approach, and can develop a roadmap. In doing so, you want to balance the implementation of the technology solutions with the leadership within the organization. So when we look at a staffing structure, first recommendation would be start small and leverage partners as much as possible. So what do I mean by that is, have a couple key leaders that have a vision, that assess the current state, that develop that roadmap and establish those relationships with the key stakeholders, and then partner them with existing organizational subject matter experts within the IT as well as the business sides, and create a matrixed team that leverages in-house knowledge as well as technical subject matter expertise within the different technology stacks that the IT supports for the business, and wrap that around that program that you're looking to stand up. In doing so, you have the foundations for those key stakeholders, those feedbacks, as well as making sure that you're focusing on the right pain points within the organization as well, and that'll help you to do an assessment, leveraging that maturity model that we talked about. Where are you today, and where do you want to invest in the future? Both from a technology side, but then also for people to run it. So some organizations that I've talked with and or worked with have leveraged hybrid models of managed services and in-house staff. So in-house staff being primarily focused on the higher level from the engineering and architectural perspective, and the managed services providing more of the operational components around that. Vendors often providing frontline capabilities for deployment and first level management of the spaces. It really all needs to tie back to your budget, the scale of the organization, and what you are looking to stand up, and also your timelines. Factors that feed into the timelines for whether or not you staff out quickly or you scale over time, can tie back to, did you just have a breach? That could be a really big driver behind standing up and rapidly maturing an organization. Regulatory findings and requirements being highlighted by external parties could be another. That's something I had experience with as well, where I was challenged with standing up an organization as quickly as possible to make sure that we provided those defenses, but we also were able to address some requirements from the outside. It does need to be dynamic, but I would recommend first and foremost to focus on those foundational items, establish what's important, and then risk rank those, and align that to your budget. And once you align that to your budget, then you can effectively establish your roadmap on where you're going to invest year over year, or how quickly you're going to stand up a solution with the operational teams to support it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, right? One organization I worked for, they had some issues. It wasn't a breach, but they had some issues. They brought me in and said, I had headcount allocation right off the bat. I think I was able to hire like a dozen people, which is great. I just had to find the right people. Different organization. I joined. I was told, hey, there's going to be budget. You're going to be able to, staff out these services and build. And, surveys said, not really the case, right? Hiring was kind of paused, even after we had a roadmap and plans, right? My boss and I had plans to do some really great stuff and reduce some risk and get foundational items in place in 3 to 6 months, and got challenged. It didn't happen. So on that type of thing, you get into an organization, Trevor. You've got the alignments, you've got the budgets, and like, I mean, what we're in Q3 right now, actually. So this is really critical for a lot of organizations that are listening. So you join late in the year, you had budget, Q3 is changing to Q4. Now you're going through a budget freeze, which may mean a hiring freeze. What do you recommend for those organizations that have plans, they have a roadmap, they had agreement with their business stakeholders, they were about to pull the trigger on doing certain things, whether it be technology implementation or policy changes? Like, now they can't staff out. What do you think folks should do, or what would you do in that case?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge that many have faced, and speaking at a high level, because this is very abstract, my recommendation would be to focus on the top priority items. And if an investment is required on the top priority items and you're not able to secure that investment, look at your other solutions. So I've said this many times to my team members. What's the gold, silver, bronze approach? So if gold was our original target, we don't have enough, funding for gold. What's the silver? What's the bronze options? What are the ways that we can meet that mission with, and we've used this term before, MacGyver style, with whatever tool that you have available, so that you can address and reduce the core risk, knowing that it may not be long term, knowing it may not be ideal solution, but at the very least, coming up with a plan on how to address and mitigate those risks that are identified as high priority. From a technology perspective, sometimes that means leveraging existing solutions that are in your environment that you may not see as being the best ones out there, but leverage them to the best of your capabilities so you meet those missions, and are able to address at least a foundational capability of managing that risk. From a program perspective, I think that's where you have a little bit more flexibility with leveraging those partners within the organization. When we talk about reviewing and potentially revamping and maturing policies and procedures, those are things that can be done without significant investment. It does take time, so you would have to have alignment and prioritization of your matrixed resource partners within the organization for support around uplifting those items. And I think that there's some creative solutions around that as well, as to take a measured approach of a little bit at a time, get a foothold in place, and then continue maturing over time. So it doesn't need to be a full, overhaul of all your policies and procedures. Identify the pain points that need to be addressed, address those first, but then put those other items in the backlog of your roadmap, so you can say, these are the things that we did. These are the things that we still know that we need to do, and they're on the future plan. That way it's defensible when you have those conversations later on, why wasn't this addressed yet? Well, we made, risk-based decision based off the information and the funding that we had at that time. But you can also state that this is a, 2026 Q2 target, and tell, when you are going to get those items completed, so that you can manage expectations, but also keep moving the program forward, even though that you may have some setbacks from a funding or staffing perspective.
All great recommendations. And, Trevor, it's clear you've done this a time or two, and I'm sure the audience would agree. So would love to hear how you got all of that great background and experience, Trevor. I mean, 25 years in IT, 15 approximately in cybersecurity, and you've built multiple programs. Did you think you were going to be a data security champion when you started out, or really what led you down that path?
Yeah. So quick background from my side, through the 25 years, I moved progressively through the ranks, starting as, focusing on, network engineering and identity and access management administration and, um, working for large organizations kind of helped me start moving towards that bigger picture view. I progressed later into management roles, specifically at an incident management perspective. So managing large scale challenges for organizations that impacted production, which is where I started getting a taste of cybersecurity and went back to school. Got my master's in cybersecurity with a focus on digital forensics, and from there, moving on to larger corporate roles that started to focus on early stages of data protection within those organizations. And at first, I had no idea what I was stepping into, and I learned very quickly that it was an area that it was a passion of mine, and it grew very quickly. It was interesting both on the people side as well as the technology, and the ability to leverage some of my training from a educational perspective. And moving forward into the various different opportunities that I've had to stand up data protection organizations or to augment and evolve them further, it's been a privilege for me to work for the companies that I have, and it's definitely something that's again, like I said, it's become a passion. So a lot of opportunities out there in the market, a lot of opportunities for every organization to continue improving within this space. But it's definitely something that it's been a lot of fun and a very fulfilling career.
I'm curious if you could go back with your knowledge today, if you could go back 25 years to when you started in IT, is there anything you would have done differently? Would you have talked to your 25-year younger self and given him any tips or anything to avoid or anything to do differently?
Well, hindsight's always 2020, and I'm sure when you talk to people about this, they'll say that I am who I am because of the mistakes and or the successes that I've had in the past. But one piece of advice that I would give to maybe if we change this a little bit to people that are just now starting out in the field is to focus on building disciplines in areas that are reusable or expandable. So focus on, your core foundations from your technology perspective, but then also start taking a look at as you build those out, being able to take that step back and see how things interconnect. And I think that that's something that has been instrumental for helping me in my career path is to be able to understand at a system level how things work together. And then from a business perspective, kind of following that same approach of how do these different things fit together as far as supporting the overall function or service that the business is providing to the customer. As you're able to understand the IT that empowers the business and understanding how that all works together, being able to take that step back and navigate through that really helps not only for providing that solution at a point solution, but also when you get to management or strategic levels, being able to really take all those things in consideration to make sure that you're incorporating those considerations in developing the right solutions and guiding down the right path for strategic development.
Great advice. Great advice. Well, Trevor, if people would like to connect with you, what's the best way to do so?
Best way to reach me is just reach out via LinkedIn and shoot me a message.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Trevor, man, this has been a great episode. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And big thank you to the audience. If you learned something today, laughed, or just thought this was great content for Trevor and myself, please give us a follow. Please tell others, and we'll catch you next time. That's a wrap on another episode of Guardians of the Data. Thanks for tuning in. For show notes and more, visit guardiansofthedata.show. Guardians of the Data is made possible by support from Sentra. To see how we help organizations discover and classify all of their data accurately and automatically while quickly achieving petabyte-scale data protection without the fuss, please visit Sentra.io. Catch you next time.